So now we're going to talk about youth political protests in global context. And some of what I'll say will talk about previous ideas raised in parts 1 to 4. So here we begin part 5, youth political protests in global context. Globally, political protests have increased in incidence and frequency in the 21st century. Yet, they are different in nature and impact from past protests. Many nations, Nigeria included, are roiled by demands for political reform, some escalating into separatist insurgencies and agitation. The youth are highly involved in these protests and agitation, both voluntarily and due to compulsion. Nigeria is no exception. Its current hotspots are in the southeast, northeast, northwest, and north central parts of Nigeria, or geopolitical zones, as Nigerians like to call them. But there's also significant restiveness and calls for restructuring all over the country. And we find this also in the southwest, southeast, and south-south zones. According to Carothers and Youngs, in a 2015 publication, the current wave of political protests is not homogeneous in typology, causes, and consequences. These two authors characterize them as follows. They say that they occur in many different countries and political contexts in all world regions. The proximate causes, according to them, are, quote, local economic and political decisions, unquote. The long-term causes include the favorability of the global environment to protests due to the vagaries of democratic transition, democratic backsliding, the efflorescence of civil society organizations, and phenomena associated with globalization, such as accessibility and affordability of new information and communication technologies. Contrary to some scholars' characterization, these are not a novel type of politics that are being perpetrated by groups that can blithely be regarded as quote-unquote rebels without a cause. Because majority of them have particular complaints, demands, and objectives. The protests also produce disparate outcomes and have limited impact on democratization, since, with few exceptions, many non-democratic governments faced with protests have been able to defeat them without making significant political concessions. Some of the protests have succeeded in creating new parties that engage the political system and influence the outcomes of electoral campaigns, while others failed to translate their protest into the building of durable political institutions. By and large, the governments of countries where these protests erupt tend to deny the protesters autonomy and capacity to independently challenge state abuses by attributing the causes of the protests to foreign influences. Carothers and Young's characterization of 21st century protests provides a useful framework to evaluate the hashtag EndSARS protests. They occurred within a global context that is favorable to protests, where there's access to cutting-edge information technology tools. The Nigerian government alleged that these protesters were influenced by foreign actors, including international NGOs such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And they failed to build durable institutions, they meaning the EndSARS protesters, that visibly affect electoral outcomes. According to Emmanuel Wallerstein, youth protests in the second half of the 20th century differ from contemporary protests insofar as they saw it imperative to contest the, quote, illegitimate exercise of power conceived within the boundaries of the nation state. Even when the state exercised its power across accepted state boundaries in imperious forms, it was the machinery and institutional apparatuses of the state as a cohesive and unified entity that bore the criticism of the protesters. The hashtag EndSARS protesters, global perspectives, their global scope, their adept use of cutting-edge information technology to voice their complaints, disseminate information, solicit support, and harness resources is remarkable. And it distinguishes them from past generations' efforts. It also incorporates them into the contemporary mainstream of youth protests. So globalization, post-colonialism, internationalization, and transnationalization and post-modernity individually and in different combinations, as I said before, constrain or enable African states and peoples to engage the contemporary world political economy. So heavily buffeted by the vagaries of globalization and their socio-political as well as economic relations, structured by differing levels of post-colonialism and internationalization, transnationalization, as well as the dynamics of post-modernity and modernity. Majority of Africans live very precarious lives. Many of them strive to live their lives in dignity, piecing together multiple livelihood strategies and forever looking for opportunities to move beyond mere survival to sustained human and material security. It is within this dynamic, competitive terrain that the youth must contend with the state and its agencies and institutions, personnel, and rules. The hashtag EndSARS protests erupted as a response to state brutality, impunity, and recalcitrant, nonchalant attitude to complaints. So let me speak a little bit about Nigerian youth and political protests. Africa has a huge youth population, with the youth constituting 70% of its population. Nigeria, being the most populous African nation, takes the lead in having the world's largest youth population. Despite the acknowledgement of their potential to contribute to national development, there are discourses within Nigeria that cast, and within the world in general actually, that cast the youth as a potential time bomb. This kind of discourses dominate the analytical landscape. Due to the paradoxical coincidence of economic growth with great inequality, precarity is normalized and routinized. Since survival, enhanced life chances, and human as well as material security have become more unattainable for the majority. Since the youth are the largest percentage of the population, they're most affected. Their random, disparate, and/or calculated decisions made individually and collectively in everyday life draw from bounded choices that shape the lives of individuals, their communities, and the world in ways that are change-making. Some scholars have associated economic precarity with potential for explosive outbursts of violent protests. For the Nigerian youth, among whom unemployment and underemployment are high, some of the popular strategies pursued for survival include both legitimate and clandestine entrepreneurship. Jakpaing, or leaving the country in a hurry as part of a migration for survival and upward mobility strategy, is another way in which the youth are coping. Criminality that also uses both physical and cyberspace methods, tools, and strategies, including what Nigerians call Yahoo or internet fraud, are other strategies. Education is another strategy too. Some of these strategies are combined to enhance the chances of success and upward mobility. Despite vocal condemnation of the fraudulent variants among the repertoire of survival strategies, social culture also worships and celebrates people who are seen to have, quote unquote, made it, regardless of the origin of such sudden affluence. Central to my analytical frame in this chapter is the necessity to engender the ability to question and challenge established orthodoxies through developing an understanding of the politics of knowledge. This is central to my research and teaching practices, and it involves scrutinizing, questioning, and challenging established orthodoxies through the politics of knowledge and dominant beliefs, opinions, cliches, and practices that undergird contemporary and past domestic and global social, political, and economic system. Doing so facilitates critical consciousness to question and delve into assumptions, superficial understandings, dominant myths, the status quo, and received orthodoxies. So while I argue that cyberspace offers opportunities for youths to use information technology in response to their economic, social, and political agenda, it is also important to note that the African continent remains undersaturated in terms of access to these tools by the general population. There is significant inequality in access, a phenomenon known as the digital divide. Only 29% of sub-Saharan Africans have access to the internet, as opposed to 72% in the Middle East and North Africa, and 88% in the European Union, 90% in North America, 70% in East Asia and the Pacific, and 68% in Latin America and the Caribbean. Given migration, diasporan Africans are likely to have more and better access to these technologies. However, due to the proliferation of mobile telephones, more Africans can access and robustly use social media on platforms that use less bandwidth. WhatsApp is one such platform. The high cost of data and poor connectivity cause many to use multiple SIM cards or SIM cards for better rates. The expense of data-driven transactions forces many Africans to use short message services or SMS and unstructured supplementary service data or USSD. The GSM communications protocol allows users to send instant messages that are not saved in the subscriber's device and or by the provider. The youth, who are a higher percentage of the population in Africa than in other world regions, tend to use these tools the most. They also tend to be more aware and conversant with cutting-edge, technologically deployed media and logistical strategies. There's considerable evidence that youths in countries where they constitute a large percentage of the population are more idealistic, prone to experimentation and risk-taking, and also aggressive behavior. They also tend to be more involved in institutionalized politics than in formal politics, in non-institutionalized politics than in formal institutional politics. Many youths thus form and or join social movements that focus on given issues and they agitate for change through protests, petitions, boycotts, and other measures aimed at getting their issues addressed. So we will give it a pause now, and when I come back, it will be with the conclusion. Thank you very much.